At 23 years old, Daniel Mercer bought a ranch nobody else wanted. He paid $7,200 for 312 acres of dry, neglected land in eastern Montana. And the moment the papers were signed, the man who sold it to him shook his hand like he had just gotten away with something. The ranch had been empty for almost 3 years. Its stock tanks were cracked. Its fences leaned into the wind. The farmhouse roof leaked in 4 places, and the land itself looked worse. Gray grass, bare hills, patches of soil so hard they rang beneath a boot heel. For years, people had tried to make that ranch work. They had brought cattle. They had drilled wells. They had planted hay. They had even tried leasing part of the property to a neighboring farmer. Nothing lasted. By the end, the ranch had become a local joke. People called it Mercer's Folly before Daniel had even bought it. They told him he was too young. They told him he was wasting his money. One of the older ranchers in town laughed when he heard the sale had gone through. $7,000 for that? He shook his head. You didn't buy a ranch, kid. You bought a problem. Daniel didn't argue. He had learned something during the 6 years he'd spent working as a farmhand. People were very good at deciding what land could not do. They were much less patient when it came to asking why. And Daniel had a question, one that nobody else seemed interested in answering. Why did the cattle that wandered onto the northern edge of the property always come back looking healthier? It didn't make sense. The rest of the ranch was brown by late summer. That northern corner wasn't, not completely. There was a narrow strip of grass running through a shallow depression near the base of a rocky ridge. It wasn't green enough to look impressive. Most people wouldn't have noticed it, but Daniel had. He had noticed it the first time he'd been hired to help clear the old fence line 3 years earlier, and he'd never forgotten it. Now, standing on the porch of his new farmhouse with the keys still in his hand, he looked toward that same ridge. The wind pushed dust across the yard. A loose piece of tin rattled against the barn. Daniel pulled his old field notebook from his jacket. On one of the first pages, beneath a list of expenses and measurements, he had written a single sentence. Why does anything still grow there? He had no idea that question was about to change everything. Daniel had grown up working other people's land. His father had driven trucks. His mother worked at a grocery store. There had never been enough money for Daniel to inherit a ranch, and there certainly wasn't enough for him to buy one. So he started young. At 14, he spent summers repairing fences. At 16, he was cleaning stalls before school. At 18, he left for a larger cattle operation nearly 2 counties away. He learned quickly, not from books, from mistakes. He learned how cattle moved when storms were coming. He learned how much feed a herd actually needed, instead of how much an owner thought it needed. He learned to read hoof marks in mud. He learned that healthy soil had a smell. And he learned that the best farmers weren't always the ones who worked the hardest. They were the ones who paid attention longest. His last employer, an old rancher named Walter Haines, had once told him something Daniel carried with him everywhere. Land doesn't usually lie, Walter had said. People do. Daniel hadn't understood the sentence at the time. He did now, because the Mercer Ranch had been called worthless for nearly a decade. But Daniel had walked it. He had seen the shallow depression, the unusual grass, the birds that gathered there, and something else. In early spring, after the snow melted, the ground in that northern corner stayed damp several days longer than the surrounding pasture. He had noticed it years ago. He had mentioned it once. Nobody cared. Now he owned the land, and that changed the question. He wasn't asking whether the ranch could be saved. He was asking what had been missed. The first month was brutal. Daniel moved into the farmhouse with almost nothing. A mattress, a propane stove, 2 pans, a toolbox, his notebook, and an old pickup that had already crossed 200,000 miles. He had $1,400 left after buying the property. That was all. He couldn't afford a new tractor. He couldn't afford new fencing. He couldn't afford a professional survey. And he certainly couldn't afford to drill random wells like the previous owners had done. So he did what he knew. He walked. Every morning before sunrise, Daniel walked the ranch. He didn't take the same route twice. He started with the ridges, then the lowlands, then the dry creek beds, then the northern depression. He carried a shovel, a measuring tape, a small soil thermometer, and the notebook. At first, all he wrote down were ordinary things. Wind direction, temperature, soil condition, animal tracks, grass height. Then the patterns began. The northern depression warmed later in the morning. The grass there stayed greener. A line of wild sage grew along one side of it. 3 cottonwood trees stood together near the rocks, even though there was no obvious stream nearby. And every few mornings, Daniel found mule deer tracks clustered around the same area. It wasn't proof. He knew that. But it was strange. And strange was enough to keep him looking. His neighbor, Frank Dalton, watched him from across the fence. Frank was 68 and had spent his entire life ranching in the county. One afternoon he walked over while Daniel was digging a small soil sample. "You planning on finding gold?" Daniel looked up. "No. Then what are you doing?" "Trying to figure out why this part of the ranch stays green." Frank glanced toward the depression. "There's nothing there." "Maybe." Frank laughed. "Son, I've been looking at that hill for 40 years. Daniel put the soil sample into a small bag. "Then you might know something I don't." "I know there's no water there." Daniel nodded. "How do you know?" Frank stared at him. "Because somebody would have found it." Daniel smiled. "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Frank shook his head and walked away. Daniel wrote another line in his notebook. "Frank says there is no water." He underlined the word no. Then he added another sentence. "Need to find out what he means by it." The first real clue came in September. A storm rolled across the region late one afternoon. Rain hit the ranch hard for almost an hour. By sunset, shallow pools had formed across the property. Daniel waited until the following morning. Then he walked. Most of the ranch had dried quickly. The soil was already beginning to harden. But when he reached the northern depression, he stopped. Water was still there. Not much. A narrow, wet line followed the same path as the greener grass. Daniel crouched down. He touched the mud. It was cold. Much colder than the surrounding soil. He dug 6 inches. The hole immediately filled with water. Daniel sat back. He didn't celebrate. He didn't call anyone. He simply stared at the little hole. Then he pulled out his notebook. Cold water entering from below? He wrote the question mark 3 times. That evening, he called the county extension office. A hydrologist named Dr. Laura Bennett agreed to visit the following week. She arrived in an old white SUV carrying maps, soil reports, and the kind of skepticism Daniel had expected. She had worked in groundwater management for more than 20 years. Daniel showed her the depression. She studied it. Then she studied his notes. "You've been mapping this?" "For 6 weeks. By yourself?" "Mostly." Laura looked at him. "How much do you know about groundwater?" "Not enough." "Good answer." She smiled slightly. Then she crouched beside the depression. "Green grass doesn't necessarily mean groundwater." "I know. Neither do cottonwoods." "I know." "Or cool soil." "I know." Laura looked at the notebook again. "Then why do you think there's something here?" Daniel pointed toward the ridge. "Because all 3 occur along the same line." She followed his finger. "And?" "That line matches the old drainage channel." Laura's expression changed. "Just slightly." "Where did you get that?" "County records." "Old records?" "A 1967 aerial survey." Laura looked back at the ridge. "Do you have the map?" Daniel nodded. He had brought copies. Laura spread the old photograph across the hood of her SUV. A faint line curved down from the ridge. It disappeared near the northern depression. Daniel placed a modern satellite print over it. The lines almost matched. Almost. Laura was quiet for a long time. "This doesn't prove anything," she finally said. "I know. But it's interesting." Daniel smiled. "That's what I thought." She told him to collect more data. So he did. For the next 3 months, Daniel became obsessed with the northern corner of the ranch. He measured soil temperature at different depths. He recorded rainfall. He marked grass growth. He tracked animal movement. He photographed the depression after every significant storm. He even placed small wooden stakes along the wet line to see whether it shifted. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. Then came the first failure. Daniel hired a drilling crew with the little money he had managed to save. They drilled near the southern edge of the depression. At 60 feet, nothing. At 90 feet, nothing. At 120 feet, the crew stopped. Dry. The ranchers heard about it immediately. Frank didn't even wait until the drill rig left. "I told you." Daniel stood beside the hole. "Yeah. Still think there's water?" Daniel looked toward the ridge. "I don't know." Frank folded his arms. "That's a lot of money for I don't know." Daniel nodded. "It is." For the first time since buying the ranch, doubt got inside him. Not because Frank was right, because the drill was. Maybe the green grass meant nothing. Maybe the cottonwoods were simply surviving on seasonal moisture. Maybe the old drainage line had disappeared for a reason. Maybe Daniel had spent his last money chasing a pattern that existed only because he wanted it to. That night he sat alone at the kitchen table. The propane lamp flickered. Wind pressed against the windows. His notebook lay open. He stared at the pages. For months they had felt like evidence. Now they looked like guesses. He almost closed the book. Then he remembered Walter Haines. Land doesn't usually lie, people do. Daniel turned back through the pages. He found the first entry, then the second, then the third. He compared dates, rainfall, temperature, grass height, and suddenly he noticed something. The green strip didn't simply respond to rainfall. It stayed green during periods when rainfall was low, but it became greener several days after storms that occurred miles away. Daniel froze. He checked the dates again. Then he pulled out the old aerial photographs. The ridge, the drainage line, the depression, the timing. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing. The first well had been drilled where the surface evidence was strongest. Maybe that had been the mistake. The water wasn't necessarily underneath the greenest point. Maybe the greenest point was where the water was already escaping. Daniel called Laura Bennett the next morning. She came back. This time she brought a geologist. They spent most of the day walking the ridge. The geologist, Samuel Ortiz, noticed something Daniel had never recognized. The rocks changed near the upper slope. Different color, different texture, different fracture pattern. He crouched beside one exposed section and ran his fingers across it. "Do you know what this is?" Daniel shook his head. "Fractured sandstone." Samuel stood. "Water can move through fractures like this." Daniel looked down toward the depression. "Then why didn't the well find it?" Samuel pointed toward the failed borehole. "Because you drilled here." Then he pointed toward the ridge. "The recharge zone may be up there." Daniel stared at him. "So the water could be entering the ground somewhere else?" "Exactly." Laura looked at the aerial map. "That old drainage line may have followed the path of the groundwater." Daniel felt something shift inside him. The ranch hadn't necessarily been dry. The wells had simply been asking the wrong question. The drilling company returned 2 weeks later. This time, Daniel couldn't afford another mistake. They moved nearly 400 yards uphill. The drill began. 30 feet, nothing. 50, nothing. 70, nothing. 90, still nothing. Frank stood beside his truck watching. Daniel said nothing. At 110 feet, the drill operator stopped. He looked at the gauge. Then at Daniel. "There's moisture." Daniel's heart jumped. They continued. 130 feet. The drill suddenly changed sound. The operator raised his hand. "Hold on." Water began rising through the borehole. Not pouring, not exploding. Just rising. Slowly, quietly, but it kept rising. The operator looked at Daniel. "That's not seepage." Daniel didn't answer. The water climbed another foot, then another. By the end of the afternoon, they had a stable water column. The test results came back 3 days later. The water was clean. The flow wasn't enormous, but it was reliable. More importantly, it wasn't coming from a shallow seasonal pocket. It was connected to a deeper fractured rock system fed by the ridge above. For decades, the ranch had been treated as dry land. It wasn't. It had been sitting above a hidden groundwater pathway, and the evidence had been visible the entire time. The greener grass, the cottonwoods, the cold soil, the old drainage line, the animals, the seasonal moisture, the failed wells, all of it had been part of the same story. People simply hadn't put the pieces together. When the news spread, the same people who had laughed at Daniel suddenly became interested. A local investor offered him $75,000 for the ranch. Then another offered $110,000. A cattle company offered to lease the entire property. A water rights broker called him twice in 1 week. Daniel turned them all down. That confused everyone. Frank asked him about it one evening. "You could sell and walk away." "I know. Why don't you?" Daniel looked across the pasture. "Because I didn't buy this place for the water." Frank frowned. "Then what did you buy it for?" Daniel thought about the question. "The chance to find out whether I was wrong." Frank laughed. "That's the strangest reason I've ever heard for buying a ranch." "Maybe." Then Daniel added, "But it worked." The discovery didn't magically make the ranch profitable. That part came later. The first year was still difficult. The farmhouse still leaked. The fences still needed repair. The soil was still poor, and water alone couldn't rebuild a ranch. Daniel understood that, so he changed his approach. Instead of trying to force the entire property into production, he started with the areas closest to the natural water system. He planted native grasses. He repaired the wetland. He fenced off sensitive areas. He built small catchments to slow runoff. He rotated cattle carefully. He stopped thinking about how much the land could produce in one season. He started thinking about what it could sustain for 20 years. That decision changed the ranch again. The following spring, grass appeared where there had been bare soil. Not everywhere, but enough. Then wildflowers, then insects, then birds. The northern depression became a small wet meadow. The cattle began using it naturally. Daniel noticed something else. The soil under the new grass became darker. It held moisture longer. Earthworms returned. The land was beginning to repair itself. And Daniel realized the water discovery had only been the first piece of the puzzle. The real opportunity wasn't the spring. It was what the spring allowed the land to become. He began selling a small number of cattle. Not hundreds, dozens. He kept the herd small enough that the grass could recover. He started raising hay on the most productive ground. Then he began offering guided visits to young farmers who wanted to learn about regenerative grazing and water management. At first, only a handful came, then dozens. Then agricultural students started arriving. People who had once called the ranch worthless were now asking Daniel how he had done it. He always gave them the same answer. I listened. They expected something more complicated. A secret technique, a machine, a special fertilizer, a government program. But Daniel insisted, walk the land long enough and it'll tell you where to start. One summer, Frank came to him with a problem. His southern pasture was failing. Years of drought and overgrazing had left the soil hard. Frank stood at the fence. You think what you did here would work over there? Daniel looked across the field. Not exactly. Why not? Different land. Frank nodded. Daniel picked up his notebook. Let's walk it. They spent 4 hours examining the pasture. They found an old drainage channel, then a compacted section, then a patch of native grass that had somehow survived. Frank looked at it. I've driven past that for 20 years, Daniel smiled. Most people do. That fall, Daniel helped Frank change the grazing rotation. They planted native grasses. They slowed runoff. They didn't drill a well. They didn't spend thousands of dollars. They simply worked with what was already there. The next summer, Frank's pasture wasn't green. Not entirely. But it was better. Much better. Frank stood at the fence one evening watching cattle graze. I owe you one. Daniel shook his head. No. Frank looked at him. You don't owe me anything. You were right about one thing. What? The land had been here a long time. Frank smiled. That's usually how land works. Daniel laughed. It was the first time either of them had laughed together. Years passed. The ranch changed. So did Daniel. The young farmhand who had bought 300 acres of failure with nearly every dollar he had was no longer the kid people dismissed at the feed store. He became the person neighboring farmers called when something on their land didn't make sense. A strange wet patch, a dying pasture, an unusual crop pattern, a section that always produced better than the rest. Daniel never promised answers. He asked questions. Where does the water go? Where does the grass survive? Where does the soil change? What happened here 20 years ago? What did this land look like before the fence? What are the animals telling us? Those questions became the foundation of everything he built. The ranch eventually became profitable. Not spectacularly, not overnight, but steadily. The cattle operation paid its bills. The hay covered expenses. The educational tours created another source of income. And the restored wetland attracted researchers from several universities. The property that had once been called worthless became a working example of how neglected land could recover when people stopped, forcing it to behave like something it wasn't. But Daniel never forgot the first day. The $7,200, the broken fence, the leaking roof, the laughter, the failed well, the little patch of green grass. One evening, nearly 10 years after buying the ranch, Daniel stood on the same hillside where he had first noticed the strange strip of green. The sun was dropping behind the ridge. The cattle were moving slowly toward the water. Cottonwoods moved in the evening wind. The wetland below reflected the orange sky. Frank was gone now. Laura Bennett had retired. Samuel Ortiz had moved to another state. The people who had once laughed had mostly forgotten they ever did. But Daniel remembered. He opened the old notebook. The pages were worn. The corners were bent. Some ink had faded. He found the first question. Why does anything still grow there? Below it, years later, he had written another sentence. Because something beneath it never stopped working. Daniel closed the notebook. He looked across the ranch. The land hadn't become something new. That was the part he understood now. It had become more of what it had always been. The water had always been there. The soil had always had the capacity to recover. The native grasses had always known how to survive. The ridge had always collected rainfall. The land had been telling the same story for generations. Daniel had simply been willing to listen long enough to hear it. And that was the part people often missed. They looked at the final result and called it luck. They saw the green fields, the cattle, the restored wetland, the successful ranch. They didn't see the mornings when Daniel walked through frozen mud with a notebook in his pocket. They didn't see the failed well. They didn't see the money he almost lost. They didn't see the nights when he wondered whether everyone else had been right. They saw the impossible. They didn't see the patience that came before it. Because sometimes the impossible doesn't arrive suddenly. Sometimes it has been sitting quietly beneath your feet for years. Sometimes the opportunity isn't missing. You simply haven't learned how to recognize it yet. The ranch nobody wanted became valuable, but not because Daniel found a magic solution. He found a question, and then he refused to stop asking it. That may be the most important difference between people who give up on something and people who eventually transform it. One sees failure and asks, "Why isn't this working?" The other looks at the same failure and asks, "What am I missing?" Daniel was just 23 when he bought the ranch. He didn't have wealth. He didn't have connections. He didn't have expensive equipment. He didn't even have certainty. What he had was curiosity, and the willingness to keep walking when everyone else had already turned around. Years later, when young farmers asked him what they should do when everyone around them said their land was finished, Daniel never gave them a motivational speech. He simply told them to go outside, walk the property, look at the places where the grass behaves differently, look at where the birds gather, look at where the snow melts first, look at where the soil stays cool, look at what survives when everything else dies. Then ask why, because the land may already be answering you. You just have to be patient enough to notice. And sometimes, the thing everyone else has given up on isn't dead at all. It's waiting for someone young enough to question the obvious, patient enough to keep looking, and stubborn enough to believe that one unexplained patch of green might be trying to tell them something. Daniel never called what happened a miracle. He called it observation. But standing there at sunset, looking over a ranch that had once been considered worthless, even he had to admit there was something remarkable about it. The water had been hidden. The answer had been overlooked. And the land had waited, for years, quietly, until one young farmhand finally asked the right question, and everything changed.